Demolition Man, released in 1993 and oddly prophetic from its mass surveillance, its contactless handshakes, its totalitarianism of compulsory niceness. The story begins in the then near-future war zone of 1996 Los Angeles, which reminds me a bit of working near Portland a few years back, but what I find most interesting about this film isn't how perversely prophetic it ended up being in some ways, but rather how it relates to the wider body of dystopian literature.
That's a brand new world!
So right off, Demolition Man is heavily influenced by and gives a lot of nods to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. But it's not a derivative knockoff, and there's a lot more happening in this film than may be obvious at first. It deserves a place amongst the respected dystopian literature of the 20th century. The story begins in 1996 with super cop John Spartan dropping into a gang-controlled compound to rescue a group of hostages from his old nemesis, Simon Phoenix. A bunch of people get shot, the two men fight, and the building explodes in a spectacular fireball due to a gas fire setting off barrels of C4. That's not how any of this works, but whatever. Phoenix is arrested for his many crimes, but when the bodies of the hostages are found among the flaming rubble...
See that, Captain? I told him! He said he didn't care!
Spartan too is arrested and apparently quickly convicted on rather flimsy evidence. The city was probably trying to avoid another riot. Both Spartan and Phoenix are sentenced to the new cryo prison, where they'll be placed in suspended animation while a rehab program eliminates their criminal tendencies and implants useful skills. But in 2032, Simon Phoenix is revived for a parole hearing, escapes, and goes on a killing spree in the serene utopian city of San Angeles, reborn from the fiery ruin of his defeat. The local police are helpless.
We're police officers. We're not trained to handle this kind of violence.
So they revive John Spartan to bring Phoenix down.
Send a maniac to catch a maniac.
Spartan gets partnered with Lenina Huxley, a young officer fascinated by the late 20th century and longing for something interesting to happen in their serene utopian city.
Don't you ever want something to happen?
Things don't happen anymore. We've taken care of all that.
Here's where we really start to get some Brave New World influence, starting simply with the character's name. Huxley, as in Aldous Huxley, and Lenina, a character who in Brave New World becomes the romantic interest of John the Savage. Pretty straightforward where this is going. More broadly speaking, though, Demolition Man, like Brave New World, shows us a technocratic society where even the production of human beings is controlled by the state.
We go to a lab. Fluids are purified, screened, and transferred by authorized medical personnel only.
Their clean, prosperous, and peaceful society comes at the expense of liberty and arguably even the opportunity to be fully human. Most importantly, despite the sleek neo-fascist aesthetic, this is not the brutal and oppressive dystopia of Orwell's 1984, full of secret police and torture rooms. It's more subtle, comfortable even.
So this is where you live, Huxley? Very not bad.
In the case of Brave New World, I've often wondered if Aldous Huxley himself even knew for sure whether he was writing a dystopia or not, a scathing criticism or a glossy proposal. We react with revulsion looking at it from outside, through the savage's eyes, but its citizens seem content to consume, bliss out on soma, engage in frequent meaningless sex, and the world is a perfect meritocracy in which every individual happily works at exactly the level they were bred for.
Well, I find my job deeply fulfilling.
Demolition Man doesn't go as far, but it goes in the same direction. And all of it is the design of Dr. Raymond Cocteau, a supreme character study of the wealthy technocrat, remaking society in his own image of order, proclaiming benevolence toward his fellow man while secretly loathing them.
To create the perfect society. My society.
It's a warm and fuzzy totalitarianism. There's no boot stamping on a human face. There's no need for force to control action when social engineering controls thought.
Safety above all.
And the result is an artificial and sterile society devised and maintained by the central planners via several methods. One way that is frequently done in dystopian fiction is control of language.
John Spartan, you are fined 1 credit for a violation of the verbal morality statute.
The most well-known example is probably 1984's Newspeak, explicitly meant to constrict the ability to think outside what the state requires. Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. But much the same can be accomplished by controlling culture. Demolition Man shows us a neutered cultural space. For example, the popular music is all old advertising jingles. It's not only devoid of political or philosophical content, but there isn't even any new vacuous content being produced that might inadvertently express a potentially subversive idea. Music has become a bite-sized commodity, completely separated from any kind of artistic expression or messaging. The people of San Angeles are comfortable.
I don't know. Lately, I just don't feel like there's anything special about me.
You are an incredibly sensitive man.
But they don't have any shared culture or shared mythology, and consequently there's no shared narrative outside the one their rulers give them. It's not as blunt as Brave New World, for example, where everyone is genetically engineered for their role in society and kept pacified with drugs and consumerism. But while Brave New World depicts a hard line between the civilized collectivists and the primitive savages existing in a separate society on their reservation, Demolition Man presents a world with a choice. Either be happy and content with the status quo, or go live in the sewers with the scraps, dirty and poor, but innovative and resilient. Notably, they aren't an alternative to Cocteau's society. They're dependent on it. They feed on it. They aren't capable of an independent existence down there. They're the chaotic half of a polarized society. This idea of a bifurcated society comes up frequently in dystopian literature, highlighting the dystopia against a utopian counterpoint. We see it, for example, in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, with the mediocratizing collectivism of a state fixated on equality of outcomes, made clearer by its contrast against the meritocratic utopianism of John Galt's community of innovators and producers. It's vaguely reminiscent of the Eloi and the Morlocks in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, only in Demolition Man, the Eloi are led by an evil mastermind and the filthy subterraneans are friendly guys. At least, the narrative is structured that way. But if we take that world on its own terms, San Angeles is one of those cases where, for some people, it can legitimately be a utopian vision. Just as with Brave New World, it hinges on whether you value safety or freedom more, comfort or individuality. Demolition Man asks us, what would you choose? Would you be well in the glittering urban park of San Angeles for the low cost of not exerting too much thought and occasionally putting some money in the swear jar? Or would you go live in a sewer and eat rat burgers to escape the soft but crushing embrace of the technocrat's paradise?
This is a rat burger.
This isn't an easy question. It forces us to really look inside ourselves and think about what's important. It's easy to fight tyranny when they're trying to send you to a labor camp. You have nothing to lose. But when the tyranny is comfortable, when compliance is easy and the cost of resisting is high, that's where it gets tough. Demolition Man is one of those stories where the slide into dystopia is hazy and gradual. At first glance, San Angeles is vastly preferable to the LA war zone we're shown at the start. It echoes some utopian stories. Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time and Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed come to mind, that present a utopian vision that upon further examination starts to look much less desirable. In the case of Le Guin's story, it's completely intentional and shows us how an anarchist society, founded on complete equality and a lack of private property, greed, and hierarchies, ends up having those things anyway, just in more subtle and less honest ways. That we're ashamed to say we've refused a posting, that the social conscience completely dominates the individual conscience instead of striking a balance with it. We don't cooperate, we obey. We fear being outcast, being called lazy, dysfunctional, egoizing. We fear our neighbor's opinion more than we respect our own freedom of choice. You don't believe me, Tack, but try. Just try stepping over the line, just in imagination, and see how you feel. You realize then what Tyrann is, and why he's a wreck, a lost soul. He is a criminal. We have created crime, just as the proprietarians did. We force a man outside the sphere of our approval and then condemn him for it. We've made laws of conventional behavior, built walls all around ourselves, and we can't see them because they're part of our thinking. I bring these stories into it because they all share the common thread not only of building an entire society around rigid doctrines and social organization, but also the deliberate dismantling of families in favor of a collective communal identity. Demolition Man tells us that pregnancy requires a license.
Abortion is also illegal, but then again, so is pregnancy if you don't have a license.
It shows us that sex has been completely cleaved from both reproduction and physical intimacy.
Ew, disgusting. You mean fluid transfer?
While it's not at Brave New World levels of vat-grown people, it's still showing us a world with a state-run eugenics program selectively breeding its own populace, which isn't always presented as a sign of dystopian tyranny. Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, which I know is an odd book to be talking about on this channel, is less intentional in its presentation of an ostensibly utopian vision that is actually deeply anti-human. It's the story of a poor Hispanic woman living in New York who gets involuntarily committed to a mental institution, subjected to invasive brain experiments, and also mentally travels to the future, starting with the utopia of small communities living in harmony with nature, but gradually skewing toward a horrifying corporate-controlled class society of peonage and environmental degradation as the experiments being done to her and the other patients shape the future. Yours is a crux time. Alternate universes coexist, probabilities clash, and possibilities wink out forever. This utopian vision goes to great lengths to erase family, with children artificially conceived, grown in a lab, and raised communally with no one knowing if a child is biologically theirs. This is the brooder, where our genetic material is stored, where the embryos grow. The inner door zipped open, but into space that looked more like a big aquarium than a lab. Bottle babies? No bottles involved, but for sure we're all born from here. And it also separates cultural identity from heritage. Communities just choose one of the cultural traditions that appeals to them. We broke the bond between genes and culture, broke it forever. We want there to be no chance of racism again, but we don't want the melting pot where everybody ends up with thin gruel. We want diversity, for strangeness breeds richness. It's so invented, artificial. Consequently, though, they end up not with cultures, but with fandoms. They're just cosplaying as Indians or Zulus or Dutchmen, changing them like t-shirts to fit their preference at any given time. It's the civilizational equivalent of Wonder Bread and light beer. Demolition Man paints a similar picture of a dead and empty culture in a few seconds with its live rendition of the Jolly Green Giant jingle in the lobby of Taco Bell. Le Guin's The Dispossessed depicts a similar dead cultural space and deliberate destruction of the family in a society with communally housed children and couples being generally short-lived partnerships subject to the whims of boredom or labor assignments. Or Orwell's 1984, with sex being purely for reproduction and the children indoctrinated as agents of the state. We have cut the links between child and parent, and between man and between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or a friend any longer. But in the future, there will be no wives and no friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth as one takes eggs from a hen. And even that is only a stopgap measure until technology allows it to be bypassed altogether. All children were to be begotten by artificial insemination. Artsem, it was called in Newspeak, and brought up in public institutions. These stories show us different iterations of societies with little or no family connections, shallow or absent cultural heritage, and the state filling that vacuum. And while serious literary writers like Orwell and Le Guin explore it with more depth, Demolition Man succeeds in conveying the idea of centralization and shallow monoculture by wrapping it up in explosions and laughs. For example, the whole Taco Bell gag works on multiple levels, going from an Americanized knockoff of traditional Mexican food to being just food. That's what you get if you go out.
Now all restaurants are Taco Bell.
They don't even have tacos, but the branding, the image matters more than any substance. Unless you watched it in Europe, where they replaced Taco Bell with Pizza Hut. Even this, with the half-ass post-production sign replacement and the dubbed dialogue that is so obvious you can't help but notice it, plays to that spoofing of totalitarianism.
My reward is dinner and dance in a Pizza Hut? I mean, hey, I like a big fat piece of pizza, but come on!
Your tone is quasi-facetious, but you do not realize that Pizza Hut was the only restaurant to survive the franchise wars.
In the Soviet Union during the Stalin years, when someone fell out of favor, they were often removed from official photographs, airbrushed out. This is usually thought of in Orwellian terms, that the state was creating a new narrative by erasing unpersons from the record, and Soviet photo editors just did the best they could to make it convincing. I don't think this is right. In Orwell's 1984, people believed the altered narrative. In the Soviet Union, though, people knew, they just didn't dare question it. The bad photo manipulation isn't meant to fool people, but to wear them down. It smacks them in the face with a lie and dares them to call it. They become resigned to it. Every successive lie is easier to accept, even if it's too obvious to believe. Which brings us to just how successful the technocratic totalitarian Cocteau plan appears to have been in San Angeles. Not only do those born into it, like Lenina, accept the rules and norms of that society, but people old enough to remember other ideals, people who were adults before the technocrats took control, have bowed to its dictates, have been worn down. Even Edgar Friendly's band of scraps, the counter-revolutionary element that haunts Cocteau's dreams, confine their actions to temporary graffiti and looting Taco Bell. That stuff's not even prosecuted as a crime in West Coast cities anymore. Despite rejecting the system, the scraps seem to have accepted that it has the power to oppress them, even though they could beat down the entire police force without breaking a sweat and own the city, just as Simon Phoenix intends to do. But the technocrat knows. They always know that the public face is a lie. Cocteau is clearly aware how fragile his grip on control is, that one good kick could bring his system crashing down. So afraid that he unleashes Simon Phoenix on his world, yet so confident in his mental conditioning program that he allows his assassin to thaw out more violent criminals, neglecting to consider that he can't control them through Phoenix. They're not rigid pieces of a hierarchy, but rather the chaotic evil counterpoint to his own lawful evil. His fear of revolt and his confidence in central planning lead him to create the conditions that make revolt inevitable. Ultimately, that's how these grand schemes go, collapsing under the weight of their own hubris, leaving everyone else to pick up the pieces. And as the film suggests, the natural impulse is to swing the pendulum too far the other way in reaction.
I'll tell you what we're gonna do. We're gonna go out drinking, all of us, get shit-faced and paint the town, literally. Put up graffiti, slogans. It'll be a blast.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
It takes Spartan to be a moderating influence. In that last scene, serving as a personification of the idea that while something needs to rein in the worst impulses of individuals, individuals need the freedom to live their own lives, not be a pawn or a prop in someone else's.
Why don't you get a little dirty? You elect clean. And somewhere in the middle, I don't know, you'll figure it out.
I want to climb a mountain and talk about a 30-year-old movie. Why? Because I might suddenly feel the urge. John Spartan's not dead, he's frozen. And when he wakes up, he's going to be pretty pissed off.